much. Well, welcome everyone. This is the webinar on Life as a CSR Professional, a conversation with Paula Bernardino. And my name is Marjorie Brands, and I am the co-managing director at the School for Social Entrepreneurs and also a representative of the League of Intrapreneurs in Canada. And today we're going to be having a conversation about corporate social responsibility and looking at this journey through one woman's eyes. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about SSE and the League and RSA before we get started, just so you have a little bit of background, and then also give you an introduction to Paula. All right. On your screen, you should be able to see a few things. We've got first the School for Social Entrepreneurs. This may be your first time joining an SSE webinar. I see a couple of alumni on the line, but if you're new to SSE, we are, as the name would suggest, a school for people who are starting new social enterprises and social initiatives. If you'd like to join other SSE programs, you can go to our website, www.the-sse.ca or www.sseontario.org, and you can click on courses in the top left corner, or get our newsletter in the top right corner to be notified of major programs that we're running. We hope you'll join us soon. I also wanted to just call your attention to the leagueofintrapreneurs.com website. So the League is a global community of intrapreneurs operating on 12 continents. And all of the intrapreneurs, 12 continents, right? 12 countries, I think 5 continents. And we are dedicated to the idea that our day jobs can actually be saving the world, that we are working in large institutions and have the opportunity through our corporations, government agencies, and large not-for-profits to do something about the major challenges of the world and from a social and environmental perspective. And so the League is banding together to look at the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN as a focus of impact. If you'd like to learn more about the League, please visit the website at www.leagueofintrapreneurs.com, and you'll find a lot of materials there. In fact, there's a new program that we're running, which we'd love for you to check out, and just click on Become a Member to learn more. So in a moment, again, I will introduce Paula and our sponsor, RSA. But for now, I wanted to just make sure that you understand how to engage with this call. So if you are on the telephone, you can press *6 to mute yourself and *9 to raise your hand. This will allow you to participate like people on the webinar, but hopefully if you have any troubles, you can just send us an email at info@sseontario.org, or you can send it to me, Marjorie Brands, mbrands@sseontario.org throughout the call. If you are on a webinar, you should be seeing something on your screen which has a call logistics display for Zoom, and there is an audio function. If you click on that, you will see the phone call-in details if you prefer to listen that way and not on your computer. If you want to ask a question during the Q&A at the end of this, you can click on participants and unmute yourself. You can also raise your hand, and then there's always the chat function where you can put your questions throughout. We will be recording this call, so if you want to just really relax and listen to what Paula has to say, you don't need to take any notes. You can refer back to the recording afterwards, and feel free to post your questions throughout the conversation, because this is really meant to be interactive, and we really want to hear from you. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Paula Bernardino and RSA. So RSA is a group of insurance companies, which include names that you may be more familiar with at the retail level, including Royal and Sun Alliance Insurance and Johnson Corporation and others. RSA is based in the UK, but also has branches in Canada and many other countries. And this is actually how we at the School for Social Entrepreneurs know Paula because RSA and SSE in the UK got to know each other at the beginning, and then over time that relationship extended to both organizations' affiliates in Canada. I'm sure Paula will talk a little bit more about that. But RSA started out as a very generous sponsor to SSE in Britain and now in Canada. And the company has been sending us mentors for our students, playing the dragons in Dragon's Dens, and running webinars just like this one on various technical and business topics like Insurance 101, how to communicate with the media, and managing finances. So Paula's been our main contact at RSA, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that relationship and how her work with a community organization like SSE has evolved. She has more than 15 years of experience in strategic corporate social responsibility and communications and public relations. She's worked for large corporations and not-for-profits. She's been specializing in CSR since 2014. So this is actually, in terms of her overall career, relatively new development. So it'll be very interesting to hear about how Paula shifted from her communications background into CSR. She's quite passionate about developing and implementing a sustainability culture across all sectors of RSA, and has developed and implemented national public and communications plans and been responsible for the management, sponsorship management, internal and external communications, and media relations. So I will now turn it over to Paula. Paula, can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into CSR as a career?
Yes, of course. So so my background is that I started off in communications, public relations. I had a certificate in public relations that I got at McGill University. So I'm based here in Montreal. And then I started my career in public relations. I worked for a PR firm and then moved. I did a lot of amateur sports at the time when I started my career. So 2 years at the Canadian Olympic Committee and then 2 years for the Figure Skating Association. And then moved more towards, I would say, corporate. I worked for a gas company and then moved into insurance. So before joining RSA, I was at Sun Life. So it's interesting, the shift. It seems that I've always done a bit of corporate responsibility, although I would say maybe 10 years ago, it wasn't called corporate responsibility, but I would be managing the national United Way campaign or handling any events related to a donation that the organization would make. So it's what we would be calling philanthropy at the time. So then when I joined RSA, then there was a dedicated person for corporate responsibility. This was the first time in my career that I actually saw someone and I actually saw a strategy for a company specifically on corporate responsibility. And then what happened was 2014, there was a bit of restructuring internally and the communications team was restructured. And then that's when I ended up with the corporate responsibility portfolio. So that's how I ended up with corporate responsibility. So then since then, it's been, a growing passion of mine. I've been reading a lot about it. I've been, going to conferences or, getting certificates just to learn more about, this function. It's a growing function. It's a changing function. Like I said, whenever I'm presenting and I'm talking about it, I would say, 14 years ago, 15 years ago, you would hear about philanthropy. That would be like, those big check photo ops that you would see in the newspapers. And it has shifted to something more strategic, corporate responsibility. And then some organizations are really just calling it corporate sustainability. So that's also like a trend we're seeing, coming on.
And what do you think has prompted this shift in companies to go from the big checks and the photo ops to sustainability? And what does sustainability mean?
So I think the shift came from, obviously, budgets today are much smaller than they used to be. And also, boards and, executive teams asking for more results and, seeing, kind of like where's my money going and how is it benefiting, our employees and also our customers. So, the idea of being more strategic also became, part of discussions. And, and then like sustainability is really like, how are you going to survive? So, if you hear of a corporate sustainability strategy, it means like, how are you going to survive and how are you going to still be, valuable in 5 and 10 years?
Right.
And sustainability is really more looking at your operations. We're seeing more and more trends of, paperless, companies, that kind of thing. Like, how are you going to be able to survive this shift in business if you don't make any changes to your operations and your decisions?
What do you think is such a threat to companies being able to survive?
Well, there's different aspects, and it's interesting. I'll introduce here the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, because those are actually issues that are threatening businesses. So a lot of businesses are developing their corporate responsibility strategies based on those goals, depending on how those affect the way they operate. Climate change is obviously affecting so many organizations, so many businesses. There's also this, human resources too. We're seeing a shift also in the way of working, people more remote work, and it's one of those things that if you don't look ahead quickly enough, then you start having problems surviving.
Yeah, I've seen a really interesting statistic and study around the mortality rates of publicly listed companies, and I can't recall the exact statistic off the top of my head, but I think it's something like in the old, only a few years ago, maybe in the 1980s, 1990s, the average lifespan of a publicly listed company was 100 plus years or 75 plus years, something like this. And now they're projecting it to go down to like 15 years. So it's speaking to a very volatile environment where there's a lot of dynamism and disruption in the market, and some of it, as you mentioned, is coming from climate change, disrupting supply chains. I heard like Mars, the chocolate company or the candy company, is very concerned that they may not have chocolate to provide consumers, which is horrifying to someone like me who eats a lot of chocolate. But because West Africa is going to be so deeply affected by climate change that they're not sure where they're going to get the supply. Yeah, so that's very interesting, and you say that it's been harder and harder for companies to justify their sort of philanthropy budgets. How have you seen that play out at RSA, and have you been able to make the case that you should continue to make contributions to the community, but in ways that are more strategic?
I think in our case, we are a bit more, I'd say, careful and also more strategic in the partnerships that we develop. And we really look for partnerships that are, more specific and where we can benefit, both sides will benefit, because we know that we don't have like the, huge budgets that other companies would have. And then also, it's also looking at what is most popular internally, for example, for our employees. So, we have, a dedicated bucket for employee engagement programs, because we know, our employees enjoy that. And then we try to differentiate ourselves too. Like, we won't be, in the same space of our competitors. Because we know we can't have the same kind of visibility. If they're putting $1 million and we can't go ahead and put $1 million too, so we will prefer going to another direction with another organization, and have more meaningful and impactful partnerships. So it's still possible. So what I want to say is like it's still possible to have a meaningful and interesting corporate responsibility strategy with smaller budgets. It's just a matter of selecting and also, really managing your efforts. So you're not all over the place. Yeah.
Right. And I mentioned how the relationship with SSE and RSA developed in the UK and then came over to Canada. Are you able to talk about an organization you're working with here in Canada that started in Canada, and what was the rationale about working with them? And so just give us an example of the strategy involved.
A current partnership that we have?
Mm-hmm.
So currently, besides School for Social Entrepreneurs, we also have a partnership with WWF Canada. When we developed this partnership with WWF Canada, the goal and, we wanted to target employee engagement. So, we're specifically working with them on this program called Living Planet at Work, where we want to implement green champions across the company.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting because, like you mentioned, our global head office is in London. So the strategy comes from the global head office, but then obviously every country develops and adapts. So, Canada here, for example, this, WWF partnership is unique to Canada because we wanted that focus, to empower our employees to become more aware of the environmental issues that we're all living. My colleagues in Sweden and in Denmark, they've identified other issues that they wanted to tackle, always, still under that umbrella of the strategy that we work with.
And how did you identify green issues as something that RSA should care about beyond, it's being an opportunity to engage your staff?
So it's interesting because, we can look at past interest in activities, that we've had. So, we've had green teams, for example, in the past. And what we've noticed was that there was a decline because there was a lack of awareness at one point and lack of, promotion around, environmental issues. So we thought it would be interesting to bring that back. If we were seeing, we were hearing that there was an interest, but they need a tool.
Mm-hmm.
So we felt like with this partnership, it would help them, and then show them that it was important for the organization to have employees involved.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what to me, the connection between insurance and green issues is quite important because if we don't manage our natural resources well, we will result in or we'll see more climate change happening, which can drive some of the bottom line losses for insurance companies in terms of increased natural disasters and so on. But it sounds like if employees aren't able to make that connection in their head that this is actually quite related to their ability to sustain a livelihood, that definitely seems to be an issue. So I think it's quite interesting that you've been able to marry both the strategic and the internal or strategic issue for you as an insurance company, but also the internal need to engage your staff. I'm curious about the work with the School for Social Entrepreneurs, because if you want to say WWF is on the environmental end of the spectrum, what do you see as the value of working with a more socially focused player like School for Social Entrepreneurs?
It's interesting because I think the partnership with the School for Social Entrepreneurs has brought us back to our roots. Mm-hmm. The reason why RSA was created, and this goes back 300 years in London, and RSA's founder Charles Povey, came up with this idea and creation of this organization because of the London fire. So behind the reason for RSA was to protect people. Mm-hmm. So there was that social value there. Insurance was created based on this social value and purpose. And I think it's interesting that I think with this partnership it's kind of brought that back to us. Right. As an organization, not to forget kind of like our roots and why insurance exists, but specifically the partnership, the opportunities with SSE and our employees is really we give our employees a lot of opportunities to volunteer, but with this partnership, it's actually using your skills and expertise to give back. which is something that is very in high demand. So that's why we've been seeing like a lot of employees, willing to participate, either by becoming mentors or by, giving webinars and presentations.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you bring up Charles Poe, because I had a chance to look into his story, and he apparently was sort of the Richard Branson of his day. He had started many, many companies, and so he himself was a serial entrepreneur, and many of these companies had a very social focus. And so in a way, Charles Povey was one of the original social entrepreneurs that our school models itself after. And I think the relationship with RSA was a bit of a coincidence, but when we go back to the roots, it makes sense that we would be together.
Yeah, and this is, I think it's an example of both organizations benefiting from the partnership. Yeah.
Right. Can you give us some examples of your favorite CSR initiatives around the world, and that can be either at RSA or other companies?
Yeah. Okay. I would say that before joining RSA, when I was at Sun Life, there was a nice one, and they're still, working on it. So Sun Life Financial in Canada, they made a commitment to help research with diabetes. And it's interesting because I was there when they launched it. And at first I didn't get what's the link with diabetes? Like, obviously, yes, I understand Sun Life, like that's your insurance carrier, whenever you have medication, like you'll send your claims to them. But then I understood, like, what they've been realizing is like type 2 diabetes, which is the diabetes that you get as an adult. There's a huge increase in numbers of cases in Canada. So the commitment of a company like Sun Life to say, well, we're going to try to help this situation and this problem, by giving funds for research and also helping people prevent this disease. I thought this was such an interesting example because both will be able to benefit. So people with diabetes will be able to benefit from this commitment from this company, and then also eventually Sun Life will be able to commit because you'll see a decrease, hopefully, of diabetes cases. So that's interesting. So I really like that case. It really shows how, if you look deeper, look at, what's happening in your organization, you can come up with, some interesting opportunities to make things better for your society.
Right. And benefit your company at the same time.
Yeah. And then also, and I'll give you another example too that I really like. It's really cool. This is within the RSA group, but my colleagues in Denmark, so they've identified also issues that they have. So one issue there, which it's hard for us, I think, in Canada to understand, is a lot of people, because they're surrounded by water, a lot of people just go to the lake or a river and just jump in and swim. So they've been seeing, they saw an increase in accidents. People actually drinking and then going to, and swim, and then would be accidents happening. So they did this campaign called "Don't Drink and Dive," targeting really this specific behavior. And it was a very cool campaign. They even did a partnership with Disney when, what was the name of that movie? When the Dory movie. Yeah. Also, just to bring awareness to this behavior, don't drink and dive. So they won a lot of prizes with that. But again, like that's the thing, like the beauty about CSR is if you're able to identify a risk and opportunity and then make things better for you and the environment and the society you're in, that's a win-win.
Right. So you've just given us two great examples of where somebody's or a company's CSR initiative is really aligned with some of their deeper business issues. Can you talk about what your hopes are for your own CSR program, how you've seen it evolve over the last couple of years, and where you'd like to take it?
Yeah, so for us too, it's all about identifying opportunities where we can make things better. So, for example, currently we're working on a road safety campaign. Obviously this goes back again, like, to our purpose of, making things safer and preventing to make things better for our customers. last year we saw an increase in number of collisions between cars and pedestrians. So last year we did a press release, just kind of like a little media campaign around that. We got some statistics from the police in Toronto. It was really like targeted for Toronto and GTA. So then we're continuing that. So we're hoping in March we'll be able to launch a campaign. There'll be a video where we really want to, focus on road safety. But, the approach we'll be taking, and I'm giving a preview of all of this, is really an holistic perspective of how do you make car drivers, pedestrians, and cyclists, kind of share the road together and make it possible to be able to, share that space.
Right. It's so interesting that you mentioned this because, and this is everyone on the call, we're discovering a little bit of an intersection in our work that is happening spontaneously on this call. But Paula, we have a program which you're well aware of. It's called Select, and that is for community-based leaders who are helping their communities transition and select a greener, more socially equitable future under a changing climate. In our Select program, one of the things that we were looking at is some of the social dimensions around road safety. So we did some research and found, at least in the United States, we're not sure what the comparable statistics are for Canada, but in the United States, if you are a Black or Latino cyclist, you are 2 to 3 times more likely to be injured or killed on the road. And that sounds crazy. Like, why would there be such a high mortality or morbidity rate around cycling? And really, there's a strong correlation between race and people living in communities where they're not in sort of tree-lined cul-de-sacs. They're closer to the major roadways and arteries. There aren't dedicated bike lanes, and often in these communities there are no sidewalks. And in some communities, children are forced to walk on the side of the grass, but really not in a safe place. So there's also an added social dimension to this, and maybe that's something we can explore together, because we're looking at that issue in the Select program.
Yeah, definitely.
So folks, you just have witnessed potential deepening of the CSR program at RSA and our collaboration with them on a social issue. So thanks so much, Paula. Can you talk also about things that you wish you had done differently? If you had started out in 2014 in CSR, things you wish you had done differently from the beginning. So that way, folks on this call can learn from your lessons.
So it's interesting because I think I arrived in this field at a really interesting moment when it was shifting from that simple philanthropy, like I mentioned, those big donations, photo ops, those giant checks, to it becoming really more strategic, and really more, companies, and also like I said, the reduced budget. So then, corporations are really looking at how am I making my money and donations worthwhile for both parties, for both to benefit. So, and even today, I find it's very interesting, anybody wanting to get into the field, because it's still such a new function. It's still there's still so much room for people to get in and grow. Even programs at universities, they're pretty new when it comes to corporate responsibility and sustainability.
Right.
So whoever's graduating with those, diplomas have a very good chance of getting a job and getting employed.
The program that you just completed in England? I think you did that one by
Yeah, so I did a program. It's a long distance program. It's 8 weeks, intense, probably the most intense thing I've done in my life. So it's with the Cambridge University, and it's the sustainability business management of sustainability. And it's interesting, and it's really more about being able to be disciplined, because it's very interesting the way it's structured. Like every Wednesday morning, you get that link to your new module. and then it's due like the next Tuesday. So it's really a matter of, for 8 weeks, kind of like just block your life and say, well, I'm doing this for the next 8 weeks. And it's interesting because it's actually you build a business case and your business case. So like I did it for my company, but if you have your own company, you can do it on your company. And then it's interesting because halfway through the program, there's a shift, and then they make you choose a case study on a field completely different from what you know. So in my case, like there was options between like, coffee, tourism. So I took tourism. So it's like applying what you've been learning on sustainability and corporate responsibility, but to a field that you have no knowledge really about. So that was challenging, but interesting because it then it makes you think differently. And it shows you that, whatever you're learning is applicable in any organization or any field.
Right.
Yeah. So I've done that. Plus, there's a lot of interesting resources out there with a lot of interesting webinars, conferences. So it's actually very interesting to be part of this field.
And I'll just forward to the next slide because you kindly put together a list of resources that people can refer to, and we'll be sending these slides to everybody afterwards, so you'll have a chance to explore more. But I've just forwarded to half dozen websites. I also just wanted to mention that there is a program in Toronto for those who are in Toronto or can get to Toronto at the University of Toronto's St. Mike's University. They have a certificate in corporate social responsibility, and we at the League of Intrapreneurs have been able to deliver some workshops in that program, and think that that's another resource, but that is more focused on Canadian examples. So, but if you aren't able to get to Toronto, or you prefer the flexibility of a distance program, it sounds like the one you did at Cambridge is fabulous for that. Were you able to get your employer to help cover the cost of that, or is that something you covered it out of pocket?
It's something that I did on my own, and it was my decision. I felt that I needed to equip myself with more knowledge. So I just went ahead and jumped in and did it. Yeah.
Yeah, that really speaks to some to real commitment on your part to the building sustainability, because when you're starting to pull in your own resources, it's like been bitten by the bug. Okay, well, we're getting to the point where we can probably open the floor to questions, but I want to just ask you one last question while people prepare their questions. Do you have any sort of 3 top tips for someone who wants to break into this field and is relatively new?
Okay, yeah. So, like I said, because this is still a fairly, I consider new field, it's an interesting time to get to know more about it and get into it. And because it's relatively new, I think being curious has to be like a good tip to be able to, do well. So, so you're able to, read, learn, follow what's happening in the field, find your passion around it. I think you also need to be patient because, especially if you work in, corporations, because, top management don't always get what you're trying to do with corporate responsibility. And then also, it's important to be able to break down that language. Sustainability is a scary word. So you have to be able to kind of break it down and actually explain what it is. Reducing your carbon footprint, that's just like, whoa, what is that? So be able to explain that. But then it's important to celebrate and promote the small wins, especially on those times where your budget is cut. Then you just focus on, like the positives and what you can win, and then bring that back to make your case. And then also, I think, like, be strategic. Find your ambassadors, find your champions, and then create your network with, those friends that can help you push your strategy, and also your external partners.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's a perfect advertisement for a webinar that we run on a regular basis. I think the next one is in May, around using your influence. If you don't have a lot of authority and a big title, how do you use your influence within a company to, or an organization to advance an agenda? So that, you know, folks,
Yeah.
if you want to follow up on Paula's third tip, you know, please register for that webinar on our website, and we'll send out a link at the end so you know where to do that. Paula, do you have any sort of just, you know, magic words or phrases that you found effective in talking to senior management around sustainability, or, you know, where you saw some resistance and then you said a few things that really helped turn that around? Do you have any examples like that?
Well, I think like in our case, employee engagement is very important. So, you know, another thing that is important is being able to put numbers and measure, obviously, because, you know, top management, they want to see numbers. So, you know, I started doing quarterly corporate responsibility results where I've, you know, turned, you know, whatever I'm seeing from employees, whether they're doing, you know, donations or volunteer time, finding numbers to illustrate that and do charts, because that's how you speak to top management.
Right.
You know, be able to tell them, well, you know, we've, because, you know, for example, we have a matching donations program. So being able to go back and say, well, this year, you know, we reached 95% of the budget, you know, it's an increase of 10% from last year. So, you know, talk to them in a language that they're familiar with, but using that, you know, good stuff,
right,
to promote that. And then also it's really a question of consistency. You know, the first couple of times maybe your message won't get through, but then after a while, like, oh yeah, okay, they'll see it. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Paula. I mean, I think that's a great place for us to pause and open up the floor to questions that people have. So if you have a question for Paula, please either raise your hand or put something into the chat function. So I will take a moment just to see if anybody has a question. Okay, so Paula, while we're waiting, we received some questions actually over email. So one person asked, do you have a list of, you know, the top 10 companies that you admire for CSR, or where could they find a list of companies that are admirable?
Yeah, well, if you just Google top corporate responsibility companies, you'll see, you know, there'll be some interesting articles. But I would say, yeah, for me, one that I admire is actually a multinational, Danone. And the reason I like them, so if you go on their website, you'll see like they clearly state their vision and their, you know, mission of, you know, bringing health as much as possible around the world. But also what I like is that step that they've taken. So Danone has become B Corp corporate certified. So I'll bring in this, you know, and Marjorie, we've talked about the B Corp certification. So B meaning beneficial. So a company that is certified to be beneficial means that not all the profits are going to their stakeholders. Some of it is going to the environment, social, and to their employees, giving back. So this is a multinational who actually went through the process of being a B Corp. And I know that, you know, they're helping other smaller organizations if they want to acquire someone. It's part of their requisite. You have to be a B Corp, and they'll help you be a B Corp. So I think it's pretty bold for a multinational to have done what they have done. So it's kind of interesting to see that. So I like Danone for that. And then if I look at my industry, like insurance, there's some actually insurance giants that are doing some good work, like AXA, Allianz, Zurich. They're part of a working group, which is part of the United Nations Environmental Program, where they're putting in place what the PSI, which is like Principles for Sustainable Insurance. You know, and they're looking at, you know, maybe could we have you know, portfolios with no tobacco for the insurance industry. So, you know, they're actually questioning where the insurance industry should be. So I think that's interesting. And then also looking specifically AXA, this was late last year, they came out and they said, we're not investing in ensuring any more fossil fuels.
Mm.
I like those companies that, do those bold actions. But it's interesting because then you always have to follow them and see if they're walking the talk.
Right.
But it's bold to come out, publicly and saying those things.
Yeah, I from my own experience working in the area of corporate social responsibility, but on the nonprofit NGO side, we used to joke that when companies start to pretend to care, you're making progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? Because, pretending to care gives you the basis for pointing to a disconnect between rhetoric and actual behavior. Right. And then, a lot of times companies don't want to be called out and told that their behavior doesn't match the rhetoric, and they will come into line if they aren't meeting those commitments. So I do think that's interesting. And I also just wanted to say, I think you're very right to point to the power of insurance companies to drive changes in the field of investment, because insurance companies have enormous portfolios. What are they doing with all of our premiums when we pay? They have to invest money to be able to meet all of the losses. So, the insurance companies can really drive a lot of change in behavior. I worked in the area of social responsible investing, and we, approach large investors like insurance companies and pension funds to get them to, lend their proxies at annual general meetings, so that we could bring up social and environmental issues that companies would rather ignore. So this is wonderful. And I'll just also mention that the League has a partnership with Ethical Corp magazine, and there were 4 case studies, including one on Danone. And there's an insurance case study, which I'll just mention, that I'm featured in with, yours truly is featured in. So we'll just send that out as well for folks if you want to have some case examples of entrepreneurship from Ethical Corp. Okay, another question we have is, can you talk about how you see changes in CSR over the next 10 years? You talked about the last 10 years, but what about the next 10 years?
Yeah, so it's very interesting this year. I'm very excited because the strategy we have in place ends this year. So we started having discussions on how to review our corporate responsibility strategy. And it's not going to be like a radical change. It's just going to be a continuum. But right now the trend is to go back to the basics and go back to your purpose, and build your strategy around that. So it's making companies go back and actually remind them why they exist. So I think what we'll be seeing in the future is more strategic partnerships and more partnerships also, but really a stronger alignment between nonprofits and profits, working together to make things better for society, for the environment, and for the people involved, employees. Yeah.
Right. This is another question that we received that's a little bit shifting gears, and it's about how do you maximize your editorial exposure, because you have a communications background. So let's say you've done this great CSR initiative. How do you get coverage of that for the world?
So I think also there's a shift in the communications field, where now we used to rely a lot on journalists, and I'm not saying that they're useless, because they still have a very important function, but I think more and more companies are relying on their social media platforms to actually get the information out there. So controlling the content a bit more, either with blogs or with content articles on LinkedIn or on Facebook, and then we've seen whenever we put out stories specifically to our corporate responsibility programs or actions, we see a strong engagement. So I think for corporate responsibility, those are the platforms. That's where you'll get the most people kind of like noticing what you're doing.
Right, right. That actually just is a good, another advertisement. uh, RSA has run a few webinars on social media and content, and I think in the webinar that's coming up in March, Siri, who's on your staff, will be talking a bit about how to engage the media effectively. So folks, if that's an interest for you, please feel free to sign up for that. Okay, if you were going to be starting a new CSR program at a new company, the person wanted to know, how would you kickstart that conversation? What would be your business case?
That's a good question. So it depends. If you're a product company, when you develop your corporate responsibility strategy, you have to identify your risks. So what risks do you need to kind of minimize from the products you sell or you produce, and then come up with some ideas, to management. If your service, it's actually your opportunities. So, based on the services that you give, what are the opportunities that you can make things even better? And then don't overwhelm. Come up with, I would say, with 3 good ideas, and start smaller, but then build build on your wins, and focus and promote your wins to be able to move on and make it bigger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what about incorporating a local or international aspect? That was another question that we received. How do you get a company to look both locally and internationally?
For the corporate responsibility strategy?
Yes.
Personally, my tendency would be to go local.
Mm-hmm.
It depends. Like if you have operations internationally, but just specifically in my specific situation, where we have, we're global. Just with the strategy, we realized that the strategy had to remain broad enough that each country could be able to adjust and adapt to the realities, because the realities are not all the same.
Right.
I think if you're able to, the more you're able to target locally, the better. You'll have a bigger impact.
Right, right. You mentioned earlier something about the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN. Do you see what opportunities do you see around that, and is there ever a connection between the local and those SDGs at the global level?
So those can be tricky. It's funny because I went to a conference back in November, and I can't remember the name of the company, and they were talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and he was saying our strategy includes the 17 goals, mm-hmm. and we want to have them all hit by, and everybody was a bit skeptical because those are a lot of goals. So it could be it could be tricky if it becomes like a check-off mm-hmm. exercise. And I think it's good to look at those goals and really see. I would say, like, what I've heard is, identify the 3-4 that are really specific to you, right. and then build your strategy around it. But make sure it doesn't become an exercise, like a tick-off exercise.
Right.
Yeah.
I've heard some interesting things that the province of Ontario has decided that for certain pieces of its work, and particularly around social enterprise, that they're going to be measuring local initiatives against delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals, and that even at the federal level, that the Canadian government is starting to say that some of these SDGs are relevant to Canada and not only to developing countries. So I think that's an interesting shift and something to watch. We've been considering running a webinar on the SDGs. So if you're on the call and you're interested in us offering that, please put something in the chat function or send us a note that mm-hmm. we know if there's actually a demand for that, because that's something we've been thinking about exploring with our community.
Yeah, because I think they're a great tool. Like you look at them, because I mean, this is what the UN has identified as, problems and issues around the world. So, I mean, this is great. Like you could go in, look at that list and say, well, yeah, this affects me. This affects me. Okay, so I'm going to build something, want this to be part of my strategy.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Okay, a personal question we have from the audience.
Mm-hmm.
What motivated you to become a CSR professional? And the person wants to know from your sort of personal life, like, early sense of purpose in your life.
Yeah, I think so. Right now it happened by accident. Like I said, there was a restructure, and I ended up with this portfolio. But when I look back, like why I developed such a passion, I think it's because I've always given back to my community. So I'm from a Portuguese background, so I've done so many things. I was involved in so many activities when I was younger in the Portuguese community here in Montreal, giving back. Still, I'm involved. So I think that social aspect has always been kind of like sleeping inside me. And now being able to like spend, most of my time, like 3/4 of my time on social aspects is really what, got me so passionate. Yeah. And then also I have to say also then the partnership with School for Social Entrepreneurs has even increased it even more. It has increased it even more. Yeah.
What about that? I'm curious in terms of the journey. What about working with a social partner has done that?
That idea of going on and starting your company and focusing on the social good and not focusing on money in my pocket. Yeah. That plus also discovering the League of Intrapreneurs. I mean, that is me. That is Intrapreneur. That is me. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're thrilled. We're thrilled to hear people identify themselves as social entrepreneurs. I mean, so many people we meet and we can identify, like yourself, we identify that, wow, this is a social entrepreneur, and they don't necessarily know it. They don't realize that that's a kind of animal that exists in the ecosystem, and it's a very, very important animal in the ecosystem of sustainability, right? So without people like you who are thinking beyond the current business model and really questioning whether there are ways that we can do better and still do well at our companies, we won't be able to achieve the world that we need. So, absolutely thrilled that that's something that you see for yourself.
Yeah,
okay.
Well, I remember when I heard about it, I was like, oh, that's what we call them, entrepreneurs. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, again, I'll point people to the league. There is a new program that is starting, a distance programming that is starting. So for people who want to be able to access league training so that you can incorporate some of these CSR sustainability principles that Paula has been talking about so passionately, you can bring that into your own company. Okay, so Paula, I think we are getting to the last question, unless there are any other questions from the floor. I'll give folks another chance to put those into the chat function. But can you talk about any tips you have for working with a not-for-profit partner, particularly one that comes from a quite different culture from the one that you're in the company?
I think the secret for any partnership, it has to be or considered a multi-year agreement, or because you can't really accomplish much just in 1 year, especially like you said, if it's someone from a completely different background. I mean, it's about building a relationship, and it's about you have to be flexible, because you can start off with a plan, but then things might happen, 6-9 months later.
Right.
I think so. The key thing is at the beginning, identify like what the goal is, what you both want to accomplish, and then be able to be flexible throughout that year, and then continually try to evolve the partnership.
I'm
But
so glad
it's about transparency. Yeah, transparency and respect. Very important.
and I'm so glad that you share that, because that is something that I think has made the relationship between SSC
Yeah.
and RSA work. Because as I'm mentioning, I mean, there is a bit of a culture difference. I mean, we are very socially focused. We're a charity, right? So we are absolutely focused on social impact, and RSA has its roots in social mission, but is at the end of the day a for-profit company. So there is a bit of a culture divide to be able to bridge. And I think that if I had any advice for people on the call, if you are starting a CSR program, or you're working in a CSR program and looking to work with not-for-profit partners, it's critical to do what Paula has done, which is work with us, help educate us about what's going to play well at the company, what are the kinds of metrics that the company needs to see to feel like this is worth a continued investment. And then on the side of the not-for-profit side sector, one of the things that we struggle with is perpetually being under-resourced and not having necessarily really strong systems and procedures, because so often, particularly in startups, and School for Social Entrepreneurs Ontario itself has been a startup over the last couple of years, and we have 20 years of experience in the UK, but only a few years experience in Canada. We had to figure things out as we went along. I mean, I remember our first conversation, Paula. You asked us, well, what does your corporate sponsorship package look like? And I was like, what sponsorship package? I mean, we don't have one. And we just made it up, and we've kind of evolved it over time. And I think there's been a lot of back and forth and give and take.
Yeah. And that might be also, kind of what we're going to see later on, is those sponsorship packages might not be what it used to be. Like, you can't just send a sponsorship package to a company and say, hey, do you want to be part? It doesn't work like that anymore.
Right.
It's really, developing that meaningful relationship between the two parties.
Right. Well, great. Well, Paula, we are almost at time, and we want to be very respectful of the fact that people are probably on their lunch break. So why don't we give you the last word? Any parting wisdom and advice that you want to give to the audience?
So, whether you're an entrepreneur or a social entrepreneur, giving back, to, your social community, to the environmental, there's interesting aspects. You can develop some interesting programs, strategy. It's just a matter of, looking at your risks as opportunities and finding the best way to make things better for everybody.
Well, on that note, that's a very inspiring note. Thank you so much, Paula, for taking the time to prepare these words of wisdom for us, and sharing all of these websites that we can learn more about corporate social responsibility and entrepreneurship. If you have any questions that were not answered on this call, please feel free to send us a note at info@sscontario.org, and we will work with Paula to get you an answer. And with that, I will close the call and say thank you, everyone, for your attention and for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.